Death by the banks of the Vistula. It was a hot afternoon at the end of August. Inside the Independence-era apartment with its big windows, it was sweltering. Sitting in the old, haggard armchair was a tiny woman with her feet in a water bath and a glass of vodka in her hand. A man with smooth features and quiet sheep's eyes was leaning back elegantly in his chair, opposite her. He was behind an oval table made of oak. A third character was a square, slant-browed, and very yellow-toothed sort of fellow with a sweaty button-up shirt and stained trousers. He was clasping his square, wire-framed glasses in one hand and rubbing the bridge of his nose with the other. These were members of the little government of a little country who had, after a hard day of work, come to unwind at a nearby friend's house. There was no tension in the air. In fact, only a heat and heaviness that nearly shimmered above the old wooden floor, while no relief came from the open balcony door. They were hoping for thunder. The windows didn't open, were jammed closed with old paint, and the building's sinking foundations, and no one had washed them in the past 50 years, precisely because they didn't open, and also because the inhabitants were lazy and careless. Regardless, even if they had scrubbed inside and outside, they could not have gotten in between. These were double windows, installed as they used to be, without hinges and simply pressed into the frame. The ancient custom was to have the second window taken out in the summertime and leave them in a cubbyhole for a servant to scour. Sitting in the high, stained armchair that still had the ottoman to go with it was Jakub Makiewicz, his face yellow and his body thin. While his long, bony fingers drummed on the tabletop, he held in his other hand a papyrosa in a holder, thick with tar, and every now and again he spat brown sludge out of his mouth into a blotchy handkerchief drawn from a pocket. Next to the vodka bottle on the table was a cranberry liquor that the yellow-toothed bigwig had fished out of his worn leather bag. There was another bottle or two left in the tank. Cranberries are used to treat pancreatitis in folk medicine, but it isn't clear if there's any way to help Jakub anymore. Most people have a very remote understanding of politicians who in their minds are a set of fat, old, ugly men in suits who blather eternally, and no one truly imagines them as beings of flesh and blood. You can joke about them, malign them, vilify them, sure, but they are first and foremost simply a phenomenon, something that exists, like the weather. At a closer look, they are actually quite like real people. The sheep-faced character was a folklorist interested in his lands and people's distant cultural inheritance. More broadly, his field of study included all West Slavs, especially the extinct ones. The fewer remaining shards of a nation left, the better, and the easier it is to get grants to study them. It is also more convenient to go on the kind of expedition in which you see an old woman and take the last words of a dead language out of her mouth in order to stuff them in a folder in an archive. Sheepface's home life was quite out of hand. They lived in a 2-room apartment with the parents and the child in the bigger room, and the bedridden grandmother in the smaller one. The grandmother had to be shifted day and night. Of course, the man needed to get out of the house and loosen up from time to time. In reality, he didn't much come to Jakob's anymore, even if they were still ideologically of the same mind, and still secretly promoted this great Poland business together. Jakob had sunk too far for that now, and it was hard to have a meaningful conversation with him. They'd even carved out their positions in this future whenever Poland became free, which will happen. What of it that most people no longer believed so and had already abandoned such an outlook? Most could now only manage a sigh about the old days, but here was the nucleus, always ready for the gears of history to turn the right way when someone will have to jump up and seize the reins. The man with woolly hair and a domed forehead was already appointed, totally officially, to a post in the Office for Tribal Culture. He will rescue all the words from dying languages, and the Rodzimy Kościoł Polski will officially be recognized. On his chest he is already wearing the symbol of 4 rakes in a cross, which are only distantly suggestive of the hands of God. The other man had a short, hedgehog haircut and a protruding, willful jawline. He stunk horribly of sweat and lived far away in southern Poland in a thick forest, where he had 8 children, cows, piglets, and a fittingly large farm. Those who went to visit him said he had dirt floors, animals inside, and that everything and everywhere teemed with flies, which meant that there was nothing else to do but work hard or drink hard. Otherwise, you couldn't tolerate being there. He was of course a rare breed among politicians because he was thin and wrinkled, but with the dry toughness of a tree stump. Like a Nenets or a Sami man in the sway of nature year after year, he had changed into something entirely natural and very, very resilient. In this stage of his life, he went home only on weekends, and his wife tended to all cows, children, and pigs. He could drink as much as he wanted and then, without a wink of sleep, head off to work at the ministry in the morning. At all times, he had a cheap cigarette between the teeth he never brushed, because washing would inevitably destroy the body's ability to self-clean. His open, dynamic mind worked flawlessly whether fully rested or at the end of a multi-day bender. His intellectual faculties were so extraordinary that they outweighed all his other faults. He was like a boulder, and it seemed that nothing could budge him. But doubt did chip at his heart. The gulf between ideals and reality had mangled the fabric of his spirit. He still actually had a couple of years before he finally gave up, unable to see any possibility of change. He tried as best he could, despite the times and circumstances, to preserve nature, holy places, ancient forests, ecosystems, everything that has guaranteed people's survival for millennia and that is now everywhere, in no matter what social system, whether socialist, capitalist, or monarchist, collapsing under the noise and weight of technological exploitation. He told everyone the same annoying, incomprehensible story. If we continue as we are, there will be a great famine, and everyone will die off, and this will all happen as soon as our children's lifetimes, and yet no one could bother to look at the history of Britain right after the fall of Rome, when it ended up in a worse position than it had been in before the Romans' arrival. People thought him a wayward eccentric, intensely determined, if a bit dangerous, who attached too much importance to the Club of Rome's 1972 report, The Limits to Growth. He also believed in Svetovid, but he never advertised the fact. The characters of these men were of cultivated resistance. The tiny woman, overwhelmed by the heat, was sinking body and soul into the bog of alcoholism. At home, she had a husband with cancer and two teenage boys who listened to loud music, never cleaned their rooms, and only ever wanted to eat and sleep like animals. Their little mother earned a pittance by translating, and the family was kept afloat by the grandparents' pensions and a frugal attitude. She was also often at the Makiewicz's, sometimes for several days in a row, until she managed to haul herself up and return to her miserable life. Uniting these people was Jakob's big living room drinking table, their shared university years ages ago, and the fact that they were the intelligentsia, a people imbued with culture and heritage who understood the world on a kind of different, fundamental level. Although these levels were different, knowledge of cow milking, autumn ploughing, tanning and old gods, or how to go to the opera and read Goethe, they represented something disappearing in the new world. Vodka was an excellent support in this strange doubt. Thunder sounded in the distance, and a fresh breeze blew in suddenly from the balcony. The sky darkened. Eva went back and forth between the kitchen and the living room, emptying ashtrays and bringing sandwiches. She never sat down herself, but kept a good distance from everything, new and old. And anyway, it had been clear for her for a long time that the Wally sheep thought very little of her. The man didn't like her, which was actually interesting. For the most part, nobody had any clear feelings about her. She didn't have the slightest idea how she had annoyed the tribal affairs official. If she'd ever knocked back a glass with them, she might have asked him directly, but maybe it's better if some things are left where they are. She had an old apron hanging by the door that she wore to take out the ash. She put it on quietly and went into the garden by the back door. Eva stood on the step and listened to the thunder. It was raining hard, finally. The August heat had frayed everybody's nerves, though it was still just as warm. In the corner of her eye, she saw a sudden movement next to the staircase. Is that a hedgehog? She wondered, taking a few steps closer. A big grey rat was sprawled straight out on the path leading to the door. It didn't move at the approach of a person. Eva leaned cautiously over it, and the animal lifted its head and tried to move but didn't have the strength. It did not seem to have broken anything, though it was seriously big, an almost extraordinarily fat creature. Poison, Eva thought. I should keep the cats away from it. Or maybe just age. Can wild rats just die from old age? And why did it drag itself towards the stairs? To get out of the rain and warm up? The rain had brought along mud and branches, and new rivers carried foam and relief to the world. They flowed everywhere, gathering towards the culverts, and it was in one of these paths that the dying animal was soaking. In fairness, she ought to kill it herself, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The creature again tried to move itself a bit. It turned its head slowly from one side to the other and shivered. Eva sighed and went back to the door. She didn't want to simply stand outside anymore, but to go towards the ever-swelling babble, where shortly will be heard sad, dragging, fierce-throated songs. They'll sing 2 verses and then drop it. No, this is all equally inane. Instead, she lay down on the bench in the kitchen because you could bolt the kitchen door from the inside, so no one could come ferreting around for anything. She went outside first thing in the morning to check if the rat was still there. If it were still suffering, Eva would go and get a shovel from the shed and kill it. It wasn't by the door, so Eva looked around the garden to see if the cats or ravens had already done their work cleaning it up. The rat was in a flat, grassy spot about 5 meters from where it had been the prior night. It was on its side, its fur was wet, and somehow striped from the rain, and its stomach was white. Its slender legs and little claws were sticking straight out to the side, so that none of them actually touched the ground. Eva felt horribly exhausted. She walked around the animal several times, looking at it as if it were a witness, the fullest witness of all pointlessness. Then she went back inside. A couple hours later, the ravens had pecked the carcass to bits and were marching with proud, high steps around the garden. Over 10 years ago, when Adam was still quite a little boy, it had been a similar summer, and the living room was full of men drinking when the big black telephone on the bookshelf under the window had rung. Even Eva was slightly tipsy. She was younger then and could drink more, which meant that life was easier to endure. The telephone was a frightful, dull black thing that swallowed light and was as heavy as a stone, a genuine artifact. It rang very rarely, but when it did, the noise was unpleasantly insistent. The party was in full swing. Someone had been sent out for another drink, and a bottle of vodka thrown down off the balcony had been lucky enough to be lying on the asphalt in one piece, a fact that everyone took as a good omen. Among the guests were some nearly complete strangers. One man had pulled his shirt open to expose a broad chest, and he was demanding that one of the female guests step on it in her heels to show that his muscles would be unharmed. The stumpy bruiser was lying on his back by the piano and pleading, "Well, step on my neck if you want to. What you afraid of? Yes, step here," as he tried to grab the thigh of any of the maidens standing near him. The deafening ring came at just this moment. No one remembers who picked it up, but they gave the line to Eva. Eva's father had had a stroke and collapsed onto a chessboard in the middle of the day. Two-way processes occur in the mind at such moments. On the one hand, one's perceptions unplug completely and are replaced by automations that are very exact, coordinated, and utterly economical. Naturally, death as a fact did not enter Eva's conscious mind. Instead, she recognized that she was drunk, that she had to sober up immediately, look at the train schedule, order a wreath, and perform several other important and necessary functions. Jacob lifted his drunken eyes for a moment and tried to understand what Eva was saying to him, but a man who has turned towards a bottle is very hard to redirect. He probably didn't understand anything, and he probably didn't want to. So she gave up with him, went to the kitchen, made a big pot of coffee for herself, and started to look up the addresses and phone numbers of the people she would invite to the funeral. She would clearly have to send several telegrams. The train left at 6 in the morning. Funeral clothing. Black. Does she have clean black clothes? The wreath. Where to order it? Get it there. Don't bring it from here. Won't even make it. It will dry out. We don't have any flowers other than roses anyway. There's no money. Wreaths are expensive. A reception dinner. How much will that cost? Mom. How will she hold up? Take money out of Jacob's coat pocket. How to get the drunks out of the house? Adam is with grandma in the country, which is to say with Mom. which is to say that they all have to travel, and that will be an ordeal for all of them, equally. For a moment, life without Jakob, without Dad, without Adam, with absolutely no one at all, unveiled itself before her. She wiped the strange thought from her mind immediately. Whatever an intoxicated person may think, they do not of course actually think it. Or do they? This interminable service, worry, clearing up, solving, setting right, shoelace tying, soiled trouser removing, as much from husband as son, and then listening to her mother's lectures was all simply wretched. As wretched for her as for all others who grappled with this folly. Ava's hands had started to shake, and she was moments from bursting into tears. The boys out in the big room had quieted down a bit, but they would surely find a second wind in a moment. Ava had nowhere else to go. Although she certainly would have left, you always can. She was like a blinkered horse who steps out on a trail and sees no other possibilities. To go back to her mother's, where everything is always done right, and everything is always right, and everyone is so strikingly good, was impossible. No matter how much she tried, Ava would never be good like that again. She has nothing on her mother, who's danced on her toes since childhood, become famous, and even then had children. How many ballerinas have children? She might ask of Ava, and to be fair, Ava didn't know. She will never let on, not with half a word, that this superficially nice, fitting life in the big, dignified Mackiewicz apartment is mouldy and spacious. And what did she have to be ashamed of anyway? It's not as if Jakob drinks all the time. He is still very much a doer. He does his little writing work, happily goes off to the shops, has the drilled-in, old-fashioned ability to know what's good, gets the best meats and the nicest potatoes, and the kitchen cabinet is full of centuries-old cookbooks, in which past generations have handwritten a trove of recipes. Ava didn't know how to cook, but Jakob, when he opened one of these books, made foods fit for a king's banquet table. From time to time, he fixed things, basically by gluing the shards of porcelain dishes back together, because whenever a platter or a pitcher broke, they held on to all the pieces, and one day Jakob would take the broken dish down from the shelf and start carefully fitting it back together with his long fingers. He started by gluing all the shattered pieces back together, and then he set this new construction into the break on the dish. He did this so skillfully that there would be no trace of a crack. They were perfectly usable and washable. Nothing had happened. They even kept the smallest shards of glaze to glue back on, and there were very many of these dishes, and Jakob could tell the story of each one, when it broke, who broke it, and where the dish had come from. Sometimes he even went and found a rare old catalogue he kept, which was an exposition of thousands of the ineffable wonder trinkets of the Victorian age. All the pictures had been engraved by some artist with more faithfulness than life itself. Photography had been invented by then, but they didn't waste it by taking photos of forks. And, as a matter of fact, as she flipped through this magazine with interest, Ava found a whole stack of things that had made it from there into the Mackiewicz household, from boot brushes and shoe horns to hat boxes. Feverish and agitated, but unswerving, Ava started to storm through drawers. After a long search, she found the black garments she needed, cleaned them with a Victorian brush, put them on the back of the armchair in the kitchen, and washed all the dishes. Then she washed the floor, took the candlesticks and wax-warming pots off the shelves, scrubbed them until they shined, washed the shelves, and then put all the vessels and little glasses back. Only this kind of activity could have kept her in her wits. She'd bolted the kitchen door at some point, and didn't worry for a moment about the partying company far away in the front room. In the middle of the night she caught a wink of restless sleep, but awoke well ahead of time, at around 4 or so. She went to see the state of affairs that was presiding elsewhere. Jakub was asleep diagonally across the bed, and the rest of the people had disappeared. No, one chap was in a ball on the Turkish sofa with a wool towel over his legs. Eva quietly left the house. The train ride and the funeral arrangements went off as if in a dream. There was nothing she needed to do herself but make peace with this, that, what and how, and the office serving the bereaved took care of everything else. The organization was located in the basement floor of a hospital next to the ambulance garage and the morgue, a place as deep in the earth as a nuclear bunker. A tiny brown door led inside, and behind the brown door was a little room with tacked-on brown paneled walls, exactly like the sauna you'd see at a kolkhoz. On one wall were examples of recent gravestones, and on the other was a pole displaying tassels of different colors and sizes for decorating caskets. Different palls were available, sateen or satin, black, grey and white. An astonishingly beautiful young woman, no older than 25, judging by her eyes, was sitting behind the desk in a snow-white blouse with black trimmed sleeves and collar, like a living funeral program. She was wearing black trousers, and her white stilettos shone out from beneath the table. She had a voice of syrup and practiced concern. They, she emphasized, are here to take care of everything. Oh, there's no need to thank me. That's why we're here. Would you like a bouquet on the casket as well? We have very beautiful decorations. She nabbed a photo album and showed Eva long, strange, contorted arrangements of callus and asparagus grasses. A similar album was for the ikebana on the tables at the reception dinner, and 1, 2, 3, everything was agreed in less than a quarter hour. They looked over some suits and agreed, let's leave them both. We'll see which one fits him better. Restorative arts. Quite easy. It's certainly necessary. Don't worry. You really can't tell. All right. Now you certainly wish to say goodbye to your father. Let's go see Robert, the bell said, familiarly. Eva hesitated. Does he look very strange? The panic called over a stocky orderly who was busying about by the morgue. Pull Robert out and see how he's doing. His daughter would like to come see him. There was a clanking, and then a gruff voice announced, Nothing at all the matter with him. Very handsome. He really was handsome, exactly as he had been in life, but somehow younger and more relaxed. The sheet set over him was perfectly sleek, but for his toes, which stuck up clearly beneath it, and it was from just the toes that Eva understood that the person on the table was truly dead. Why is it specifically legs that have this effect? Maybe dying starts from the toes. Would they then be the part that has been dead the longest? There was nothing to do besides look. And how long are you really going to look? Still, this little moment bored its way into Eva's memory and haunted her frequently for the rest of her life. She had the feeling that her father's soul, if such things exist at all, was tied somehow to that horrid morgue and could never get free, and that she should only manage to remember her father there on a steel frame, a burly orderly at the handle ready to push the cadaver back into its drawer. This wasn't the last time she saw her father, but when she was looking at the corpse in the casket some days later, she had no longer the feeling that this person was her father. The face had turned very yellow, despite the adroit hands of the aesthetician, who was the same pretty young bunny. To the sides of his uniformly powdered yellow face, his ears struck the eye sharply. His auricles were big and stretched out, and their ends had turned a sunken purple. Soon everything was over. The most important part of the funeral seemed to be the picture-taking before the sermon and the Bible reading. Everybody stood at attention next to the casket, and Eva could not understand where such a funny custom came from and why it was still followed. In fact, she even thought that they shouldn't actually open the coffin, and wondered why this was necessary. But then she grasped it somehow. You must, otherwise you never get confirmation that the person is dead. People have to see so that their knowledge of the person can be fixed. If not, the fact of the death becomes detached, and no one can connect it to the departed as an individual, who is thus remembered as something quite different from a motionless idol with hands on their chest in a cross. And didn't he luck out, he who so feared death, that God sent him an end that no one could have feared or expected, that was simple and quick. He no longer needs to fear anything, and that's a good thing. People cheered up as soon as the reception dinner, told funny stories, and someone or other knocked his fork against the side of his glass, stood up, neatened his beard, and started to recount how he and Robert had, back in the day, and what happened after. In an hour even this fun was over, and the gathered crowd went off, all in different ways, and the deceased scarcely ever came to mind again. The kind of real grief with which a person can't come to grips was felt by no one, because no one is ever close enough to a living person that they should truly care about him. So the only thing that troubles the bereaved is the eye, which is to say, were they good enough to the departed? Could they have done something more than they had? Did they need to poke around inside their personal guilt and moral well-being? Sadness. Such guilt doesn't replace true sadness. As soon as the next day the grievers could blithely go to the shop, buy themselves new mittens or a pair of boots, and worry about trivialities like the color of wallpaper, dust on the windowsill, or over-salted soup. And just the same thing happened with Eva. There was nothing but the image of her father in the morgue floating before her eyes as she went to bed, which didn't much frighten her, but simply remained for a time before she managed to scatter it with other thoughts. Nothing else happened. It wasn't strange, wasn't hard to understand, was exactly as it should be, as is due, and even her own death, waiting patiently somewhere, seemed somehow much simpler and more natural. For a moment it seemed to her that death was something real, and that life, on the contrary, was a strange aberration, and that it is the living who are on the wrong side, so to speak, and have not yet entered reality. Because after so many ages, The countless horde of the dead certainly outnumbered the forces of the living. Not an army of the living dead, but an army of the dead living. And here her logic ended. When she got home, Adam clutching her hand, the house was locked. They got in the outer door, but the key was stuck in the inside lock of the inner door. Eva pounded on the door, but nothing came out but the sound of revelry. They went around the back of the house to see if they might get in through the kitchen, but it was the same story there. Someone had stuffed the key into the lock from the inside. Eva sensed hazily she could hear a woman's drunken laughter inside the apartment. "Let's go," she said to Adam. "Let's go to the country." For half the journey she carried the tired child in her arms, though she was herself very tired, numb in fact. When she got onto the bus and went to buy her ticket, she couldn't find her wallet, and searched for it for what seemed like the longest, most embarrassing minutes of her life, and she still didn't find it. "I suppose I dropped it when I was carrying the boy," she finally said. Behind her, several people were still waiting to get on board. "Listen, please, I have to go. I can't get into my house. I don't have the key," she pleaded as a last resort. "Well, go sit then," the bus driver said to them, looking away in the distance. Eva burned the whole way. She was so ashamed that she didn't know where to hide her eyes. She had the feeling that the entire bus full of people was thinking only one thing. "See, can travel like that too, for free. Clever of her." Jacob died of gastrointestinal bleeding. It was October. He was 52. Adam was 20 and Eva 49. Papa Mackiewicz left his son a sizable inheritance. Some relative on his mother's side, who'd managed to get away to Germany, had left Jacob her share, and while he had been too lazy to deal with the particulars, Adam did eventually receive the money. With it, he bankrolled his friends' parties, life in the house, and even some other things. But though it was a nice chunk of money, he managed to go through it extremely quickly, and the bottle was empty in a year.